Hello, everybody. My name is Tzeporah Berman. I am the International Program Director at stand.earth. I'm also the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And I've been working on environmental campaigns now for almost 30 years. I was asked to read to you today from some of my work. So I chose my first major book, This Crazy Time, Living Our Environmental Challenge. And I thought I would read you some excerpts, a couple from all the way through. I wrote this book because I had done at that point about 20 years of environmental campaigns. And there are so many books out there that will give you the facts, tell you the issues, and they'll scare the pants off you. But they won't really tell you what to do about the issues that keep you up at night once you get up in the morning. I feel like I've spent the last 30 years trying to figure out how to effectively advocate on the issues I care about. And I won some campaigns, lost some, and I've learned a lot along the way. And so I wrote this book because I wanted to share it. I wrote it predominantly as stories, so it would be easy to read and hopefully learn from and inspire people, maybe some of you, to go out there and create your own stories. So I'm going to start the reading. My book is roughly made into three areas. One that focuses on kind of the early work I did. It's called Blockades. Then part 2 on boycotts and part 3 on boardrooms. And then the fourth area is climate reckoning, because a decade ago I was really in the beginning of my climate journey. And then after that, I'm going to read a piece that I wrote more recently on climate change. So this reading that I'm going to do right now comes from the section that's called Blockades. And it really is from, the first moment when I started understanding what was going on. So really, it's we're back in the early 90s with this reading. For me, environmental awareness has always been a bit like toothpaste. Sometimes you squish too much out, but there's no way to get it back in the tube. There are so many times I've been kept up at night by the challenges facing our forests, our oceans, our atmosphere. And I'll lie awake staring at the ceiling, wishing I could go back to a time when I didn't know. Once you have that environmental lens, you start to see everything through it, whether you want to or not. You pick up your toothbrush and you think, where did this plastic come from? You look at your toothpaste and ask, when the toothpaste is gone, am I just going to throw this metal in the garbage? My trip to Europe, that was a trip that I had taken the year before, where I was really devastated by the smog in Athens and some of the dead forests that I hiked through in Germany. My trip to Europe smashed the toothpaste out of the tube for me, and it was really the beginning and the dawning of my environmental awareness. I started to really notice the articles in the newspapers about species extinction, PCBs, toxins, acid rain, and the hole in the ozone layer. It was through these articles, it was as though these articles had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, and I had to confront the concerns addressed. As one of the grandfathers of the modern environmental movement, Aldo Leopold, poignantly wrote in a Sand County Almanac, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives in a world of wounds. An ecologist must either harden his, or I would say her, shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and doesn't want to be told otherwise. Slowly throughout that year, it began to dawn on me that all of these problems facing our planet aren't a bunch of disparate issues. We're living in a world in which we're divorced from the origins of what we use and create, and we blindly ignore where the cast-offs, the refuge, and the garbage go. I remember standing by the garbage one day with a bunch of old batteries wondering, where do they go when we throw them away? And it really hit me that if everything is really connected as an ecosystem, there's no way. I wanted to know how I could do my part before it was too late. With the drive, commitment, and I admit the unbearable dogmatism of youth, I refused to get a car. I became a vegetarian, and for a short period, I bought only used clothing. Though I'm mostly back to doing that now. As part of my exploration of the issues and my place in relation to them in 1991, I took an ecology class at the University of Toronto. One day, my professor showed us slides of the Carmana Valley in the Canadian temperate rainforest. I was stunned by the majesty of the forest, by the height of the Sitka spruce and the Douglas fir, and the breadth of the old gnarled cedars clothed in rich green moss. I had heard of the Brazilian rainforests between campaigns by stars like Sting and groups like Rainforest Action Network with their early attacks on companies like Burger King who hadn't. But I was shocked to discover that Canada even had rainforests. It seemed crazy to me as a Canadian and now a self-identified environmentalist that I knew so little about our forests. It seemed even crazier when I discovered that British Columbia had a quarter of the world's remaining temperate rainforests, 70% of Canada's biodiversity. That some of the trees were over 1,000 years old and we were mowing them down like matchsticks. So I stuffed my backpack, bought a plane ticket, and with a grand total of $200 in my pocket, I flew to British Columbia to visit the rainforests and see what I could do to help. The people who loved me when they got over thinking I'd lost my mind thought it was nice. The family consensus was owls, bears, deer, saving the forest. That's such a nice thing for her to do on her break. I knew no one in BC, so I stayed at a youth hostel near Jericho Beach, made my way down to the Western Canada Wilderness Committee office and walked in and said, I want to volunteer for the rainforest. I cook. Can you sign me up? I was totally enamored by Western Canada Wilderness Committee and that they were dedicated to raising awareness. I loved their strategy of building trails and doing scientific research and bringing politicians and journalists and people from all walks of life to see these 1,000-year-old trees. They were doing research on marbled murrelets, a seabird they believed would be BC's answer to the spotted owl, an endangered species that would save a forest if its dependence on old growth as habitat could be proven. After I'd spent days sitting in the office licking envelopes and doing any task given to me, the founder, the perpetually disheveled Paul George, ambled out of his office and barked, "Is that girl still here? Someone take her up to the camp. She's done her time." Joe Foy, one of the Western Canada Wilderness Committee leaders, was going up and offered to take me. He told me I could help cook and support the research teams. His truck arrived at the Upper Carmana in the middle of a warm July night. There was no moon. You couldn't see a foot in front of you, and we didn't have flashlights. It was hot and dusty, and Joe said, "Just follow me." Fortunately, I remember he was wearing white runners because they were all that kept me from losing sight of him and killing myself on the trail. I followed Joe's runners, but kept stumbling on sharp, jagged sticks that scraped my ankles and legs. The air felt hot and dusty and dry. But then suddenly the air was cool and moist and smelled amazing. My first experience of the rainforest was in the dark. I set up my tent in the dark, feeling around for a place to pitch it. When I woke up the next morning and crawled out, I discovered I was in the middle of a Sitka spruce grove in the Upper Carmana. Some of the trees were over 300 feet tall, the same height as a 30-story skyscraper, and 600 or 700 years old. At 5'8", I didn't even reach up to the beginning of the root base of the tree next to me. Standing there, staring up at these magnificent giants, I was struck by their size and the lush beauty and strength of this place. I felt an intense wave of awe, and I felt strangely peaceful and at home. When I think back on it, I realize that this was the first time I really experienced a deep sense of spirituality. Until then, I had equated spirituality with religion, and religion for me at best had been about history and heritage and community. It had also been about requirements and to a certain extent, morality and right and wrong. At its worst, it had been about rules that seemed out of date and arbitrary, restrictions that made me claustrophobic, and a sense of superiority and competition that I found offensive. I'll never forget that moment of crawling out of my tent and feeling so small and insignificant, but amazingly alive. It was as if the earth was humming beneath my feet. I experienced nature with all of my senses. I could see it in the ferns as high as my shoulders and the carpet of moss a foot deep. I could hear it in all the complex and varied sounds of the forest. I could smell the foliage, and as I was a city girl and an academic, This was the first time that I felt and allowed nature to envelop me. I don't really think of myself as a spiritual person, but that depth of feeling, the awareness that I was part of this living, breathing, complex system would fuel my work for decades to come. My experience in the ancient rainforest valley on Vancouver Island that was threatened by imminent logging, my own recognition of how little I understood and appreciated the natural world and how complex and rich it is, drove me to try and understand its ecosystems and the impact that we are having on them. I'm going to fast forward there just to my hike back out. I hiked back out to the truck because we'd left most of our stuff there the night before, and I realized why the air had felt so different. As soon as I stepped out of the forest and into the clear cut, I hit the dry heat like a wall. I'd read about how clear cutting creates its own microclimate, but I hadn't imagined you could feel it. The actual look of the clear cut was worse than any I'd ever imagined. It was devastating. As far as the eye could see was a tattered landscape of massive stumps and endless piles of slash. I had known that some of these forests were being logged, but no one could have prepared me for the shock of what seemed like an endless sea of stumps and debris. So I'm fast forwarding in that chapter to near the end. I went back to Toronto to school and came back the following summer. The next summer, I came back to the coast and contacted the researchers to see what I could bring to camp. They told me they desperately needed a truck and some more supplies and volunteers. I convinced a few friends to come along, bought a used truck with the money I had raised at fundraisers at U of T, and headed back to camp. After arriving on Vancouver Island, we got an early start and set off for the Walburn Valley to hike and swim in my favorite spot before going to the research camp. We drove for hours on the logging roads trying to find the trailhead. I was just about to give up and admit to my friends that we were horribly lost, and I couldn't believe I didn't know where we were when things started to feel eerily familiar. We parked the truck at the end of a new road in a fresh clear cut. It took me a couple of minutes to get my bearings, but I soon realized we were standing at the ancient cedar grove that I had known so well from the summer before. I found the waterfall that we used to swim by. It was now just a trickle of water beside a dusty logging road. In horror, I realized we were not far from where we had found the marbled murrelet nest and proved that these birds depended on this for these forests. I took off at a run and seconds later sighted a couple trees left standing in the middle of the carnage. In a pattern I would see repeated 100 times in many years to come, the whole area had been completely clear-cut logged, leaving only a tiny patch of forest around the tree where we had found the nest. There were no murrelets. I was furious. This wasn't supposed to happen. We'd found the nest. We'd done our job. We'd proven the science. The forest was still supposed to be there. This moment was seminal in my journey as an activist. Until that point, I had faith that with the right research, the right education, we could save these forests. That day, I realized that science in and of itself was often too slow to affect social change, and having the facts on your side simply wasn't enough. This was crudely illustrated to me later when I met with one environment minister to argue for the protection of these rainforests, my first meeting with a minister, and he bluntly replied, "But what's in it for me?" It was simply not enough to prove that logging would have negative ecological consequences, or even that it would do irreversible harm to threatened species. We had to prove that protecting the forest would have benefits to the decision makers, or that their inaction would have negative consequences, real or perceived, economic revenue, reputation, or vote impacts on economic revenue, reputation, or votes. Even though we could prove scientifically this area was important, that information wasn't enough to save the forest. As I stood in the clear cut, I felt fear, anger, and a deep sense of loss. I heard a shriek and looked up and saw two eagles circling above and screaming. For years afterwards that day, those eagles haunted my dreams. And throughout the coming years, I learned that politics, short-term economics, and greed would usually trump science. Okay, well, that was sad. Let's find a better part to read. Oh, here's a fun part. I get arrested and go to jail. Let's start that one. All right, this chapter, chapter 3, is called Surfing the Backlash, Going to Jail. When they really start attacking you, it means you have their attention. Surf the backlash. It's going to be a wild ride, but it will take us farther than our budget ever could. That was advice from Chris Hatch, my husband, at the beginning of the Great Bear Rainforest Campaign. At the end of the Clayoquot summer, 1993, I wrote in my journal, corporations have to follow environmental regulations or they'll be fined, and they call it the cost of doing business. I'm mad that none of these men have ever gone to jail, but I've watched hundreds of people now get dragged away for standing on a logging road because they wanted everyone to hold off and think about it for a second. I'm mad enough to shake it all up and see if it will come unstuck. It felt as if we'd done everything we could do to unstuck things in the summer of 1993, and nothing was changing. So the piece that I skipped is that after the devastation in the Walburn Valley and Carmana, I left the scientific research camp and joined a group of protesters who were driving to Tofino to support the local community who was blockading the logging operations. I volunteered on the blockades for 2 summers, 1992 and 1993. So this is near the end of 1993. It felt as though we'd done everything we could to unstick things in the summer of 1993, and nothing was changing. We had worked night and day on the largest act of civil disobedience in Canada's history at that time, and the logging continued unabated. More than 12,000 people visited our peace camp. Nearly 1,000 people were arrested on the blockades, and public opinion was now solidly in our favor across the country. But the logging companies were still hauling off 1,000-year-old trees every day. The night of the first sentencing of people who had been blockading, Chris and I realized the only way to stop the logging was to stop the buyers, those who purchased pulp and paper and lumber. I talked with Karen, who was running the Greenpeace Canada Forest Campaign, and we came up with a plan to figure out who was paying McMillan Bloedel to cut down these ancient trees. Originally for me, the campaign was all about place, the pristine valleys, the majestic trees. I realized I'd achieved a new level of maturity around the issues when I started to understand the people. After I started learning more about the products, we didn't know how to follow the money yet, but we could follow the products. We knew we couldn't get everyone to stop buying the wood, but we could try to make buying products made from old growth forests as politically and socially unpopular as investing in tobacco or butchering elephants for ivory. We didn't have a lot of skills. We didn't have a lot of systems or money. We literally followed the logging trucks to see what mill they went to. Then one of us would pretend to be a student, take the mill tour, and casually ask where the wood was going. We'd hang out in local bars trying to overhear conversations that mentioned the names of customers. These days, chain of custody research is less spying than science. Many organizations now have staff dedicated to examining shipping data, following mills and pulp flows in complex databases, tracking how the product travels from Canada to the United States, because 80% of Canadian timber and pulp is still exported to the US. But back in the days of mill visits and barroom eavesdropping, after we collected the names of a couple big name customers, Scott Paper in the UK, BBC Wildlife magazine, I would buy plane tickets, a suit from Valley Village thrift store, and go to Europe to meet with the customers. We quickly discovered that the companies were convinced that they were buying only second growth forest that was selectively logged and that they weren't buying from any clear cuts. It was up to us to show them through their purchasing practices that they were partially responsible for clear cutting temperate rainforests. We were determined to ensure that the companies buying wood from Clayoquot Sound, at least, knew that they were under scrutiny for their actions and that they were preparing to let customers know just out of step how we were preparing to let their customers know just how out of step they were with contemporary concerns and values. But that day of the arrests at the Clayoquot blockade, the first task was to get out of jail. Our first stop after being arrested was the tiny jail in Ucluelet, a small town southwest of Clayoquot Sound. While I was in the cell, an officer I'd been talking to for weeks came to the door. Ucluelet was a small RCMP detachment, so by now I knew the officers fairly well as I'd been talking to them on the blockades every day. You ever seen that cartoon where the sheepdog and the wolf punch in for work every morning and say hi before they start to chase each other? Each day was kind of like that. The officers would arrive every morning. We'd all say hi before slipping into our roles. I'd say, "Hi, Frank." Frank or whoever it was would say, "Hey, Tzeporah." And I'd say, "Look, don't worry, everything's under control. Everyone here has committed to remain peaceful. There are this many people who have decided to block the road today." And the officer would say something like, "Okay, thanks. Looks like rain tonight. You guys getting those ditches dug?" It was all remarkably normal yet surreal at the same time. After I was arrested, it wasn't a surprise when one of the officers came to my cell and told me he was sorry and that he and others had been against me being arrested. So part of the story earlier is that I was arrested off the side of the road. I wasn't actually blockading the trucks because I was a spokesperson and an organizer and I wanted to stay there. And at the time, if you were arrested, you had to sign a bail agreement saying you wouldn't go back to the area. But I was arrested off the side of the road and charged with 857 counts of criminal aiding and abetting because I was one of the main organizers. This is the beginning of that story. I've been arrested now off the side of the road and I'm in jail. So after I was arrested, it wasn't a surprise when one of the officers came to my cell and told me he was sorry and that he and others had been against my being arrested. But once he started talking, it was clear he wasn't that sorry. "You're a bright woman," he said, "and I hope this is a lesson to you that you have to switch tracks. You don't want to be on the wrong side." How do you define the wrong side? You know exactly what I'm talking about. You can't get in the way of progress. But I just don't think this kind of devastation is progress. His compassion shifted to anger. "You're inspiring people so that they want to get arrested and it won't change anything." "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't realize inspiration was a criminal offense now. And I think that we will be able to make social change. Think of the lunch counters. Think of Gandhi and the salt marches." And he said, "You know what, Tzeporah? You're a bit big for your britches. And you'd better just remember that the flame that burns brightest is the flame that burns out the quickest." The flame that burns brightest is the flame that burns out the quickest. It wasn't a threat, but not long afterwards, it seemed like a pretty accurate prophecy. When I've met young environmentalists over the years, one of the first things they asked me is how to avoid burnout. But when I was in my mid-20s, I never imagined burnout was possible. Once I became an activist, I barely imagined a life beyond the cause was possible either. One of the other challenges was wrapping my head around the idea of being on the wrong side of the law. I wasn't afraid of challenging rules, but I'd always challenged them the right way. My sister Wendy was now a lawyer. Breaking the law and advocating for other people to break the law, it rocked me to my soul. I spent a lot of sleepless nights thinking about the law, but also thinking about my heroes, Martin Luther King, Petra Kelly, Gandhi, and how unjust laws were changed. I'm going to skip forward to my time in jail. The other prisoners and I were brought from Ucluelet to Nanaimo Correctional Center, and the officers walked us through the prison. That was scary because there were a lot of drunk and angry men in that jail who started catcalling and threatening us. While the guards were processing us, they asked us to strip down. And that was when I realized I'd started my period. So I went over to the guard and said, it's that time of, he turned various shades of red and with a panicked voice said, "I'll put you in the infirmary. Wait here. It will be okay." I knew it would be okay. This had happened to me every month for years and it wasn't that scary. He put me in the infirmary where there was a TV. I wasn't locked up and no one else was there. So I flicked on the TV and the first thing I saw was myself. I hadn't slept in days and there I was watching myself be arrested on national television. After half an hour, the guard came back and gave me my prison garb and a complete selection of what must have been every possible kind of pad, tampon, and liner in the Nanaimo drugstore. I put on my prison outfit and went to where belongings were cataloged. As I emptied all my pockets and dumped out my bag, I discovered I had almost $5,000 in small bills that people had been shoving at me during the protests and rallies as donations. As the intake officer counted the money, he looked at me as though I'd done some kind of drug deal. We had a concert. Midnight Oil came to the blockades. I'm a spokesperson. People give me money. I trailed off when I realized I was only making the situation worse. The guards had separated the protesters from the locals because of the potential for violence, so it was a relief when I got to the special section where they were holding other Clackwood protesters. Our cells were together and we got to eat together. That was when I grew to admire Betty Craswick, a feisty, white-haired former civil rights protester with a Southern accent. She went on to become one of BC's best-known activists, serving more time in jail for protecting trees than anyone else in Canada. Betty had already been in jail for 10 days, having been arrested on the first day. Many protesters were vegetarian and wouldn't eat the prison food, so Betty had persuaded the guards to let her cook. Along with many others, she had refused to sign the bail conditions that required protesters to agree not to go back to the area. Like her, I wasn't prepared to sign such a bail order, which I believed was a total violation of her right to lawful assembly. So I was expected to settle in for the long haul. That day, one of the officers I knew quite well came to see me and apologized. He didn't think what was happening was right. I asked him what I was doing in jail. And he said, "They want you off the road." They? Look, it's not our fault. Our orders came from above. Just so you know, the police are working with McMillan Blodell to build the case against you and with the AG's office. This did not sound good. The next day, we all received our prison request forms to ask for toothpaste or other small items we needed. At the bottom of the form was a category that read other. So in that space, I requested a press conference and access to a CBC camera. A half hour later, I was brought in to speak with one of the higher ups, and he was totally frustrated. "I see you've requested a press conference. I don't think that's going to be possible." "I'm allowed visitors, right?" "Well, I'm requesting CBC with a camera crew." He said that wasn't standard protocol, but he smiled and said he'd try and figure it out. I think he might have figured it out too if I'd stayed in jail much longer. A little later that day, a guard came to tell me I had a visitor. I went to the visitor's room and there was my oldest sister, Kareem. Oh. And she was trying hard not to cry. She and her husband, Jeff, had been in BC to visit me on the blockades and were on their way home to Toronto when they had heard what happened, canceled their flight and booked a trip to Nanaimo. We talked. I told her I was going to be okay. Karine told me she could buy me things from the prison canteen and offered to get me whatever I wanted. I was a strict vegetarian at the time and all they had were to eat in the canteen were chocolate bars. I asked if she could buy me 30. She looked at me as if I was crazy and I said, "Well, there are 30 other prisoners in my unit and we do everything together." So I went back to the tank with 30 chocolate bars. Chris came to see me that day too. He told me later that he'd arrived just in time to see my sister tear a strip off the prison guard who was refusing to let her see me. Are all Berman girls this fierce? I laughed to think of Karina as fierce until I remembered her catching me smoking when I was 15. My sister can be fierce. The next morning, I was half asleep when a guard came to my cell to wake me with some totally unexpected news. My lawyer had arrived. I sat up quickly, startled. I didn't have a lawyer. I definitely had no money to pay a lawyer. I didn't have enough money of my own to reimburse Green for the chocolate bars. I went to the room where prisoners meet with their lawyers, and in walked this guy in an Armani suit. "I'm a senior criminal attorney in British Columbia, and I want to represent you. I'm pulling together a legal team." I said the first thing that popped up into my head. I don't have any money." He smiled. "Yeah, we figured that." The next day, he went to court and fought the bail requirements pro bono. The provincial government fought back, but he won. And I didn't have to sign bail conditions to stay clear of Clackwood Sound. After 3 days in jail, I was released without charges or parole and went right back to the blockades. Once I was back at the camp, I discovered that Wendy and my friend Karen had tried to figure out the best way to get me out of jail and decided to call the most famous criminal defense lawyer in Canada to represent me. They phoned Clayton Ruby in Toronto and he told them he'd seen my arrest on the news and was happy to help. He'd called one of the top lawyers in BC, and that's why David Martin flew to Nanaimo that night. The bad news, and the truly shocking news for both David Martin and me, was that after I returned to the blockades, I wasn't charged with blockading the road as everyone else had been. BC's Crown Attorney invented a whole new crime for me: aiding and abetting every single person arrested on the blockade that summer. Throughout the summer, I was recharged every couple of weeks and served again with additional charges reflecting the new arrests on the blockades. By the end of the summer, I had been charged with 857 criminal counts of aiding and abetting. Yeah, that was an intense time. So you'll have to read the book to find out what happened to those charges, but I'm here now, and I didn't spend 6 years in jail, but it was quite a wild ride. Okay, I'm going to, looking at our time, go forward in the book to The first markets meeting. After my trial, Greenpeace International hired me to build a new international forest campaign. I'd tried implementing solutions through academia and science, creating public campaigns and coordinating massive protests, building coalitions with First Nations and lobbying government. It was time to follow the money and research who was buying the wood and paper products that came from those trees. In early 1994, the Greenpeace office in the UK discovered that Scott Paper was buying products from Macmillan Bloedel, harvested in Clayoquot Sound. They were making toilet paper out of old growth rainforests. At our first meeting in London with Scott Paper, we laid out what we'd learned about the source of their paper. Their response, which would later be echoed by many of the companies we met with that year, was, "Oh no, our paper's not made out of clear-cut old growth rainforests. Ours comes from sustainable harvesting. And we never buy old growth." The government and industry's PR machines were in full swing. Whether it was denial or the result of outright lies they were being fed, many of the international customers we met with insisted we were wrong about the source of their products until we showed them the pictures and chain of custody research. Then all hell would break loose. Many company officials were privately shocked to hear that they were making toilet paper, magazines, or newspapers out of rare ecosystems that were the result of 10,000 years of post-glacial activity, that some of the trees were 1,000 years old, that the forests were home to black bears and wolves and numerous species that don't live anywhere else on Earth. By the second meeting, Scott Paper and others moved on to another line of argument. All the products we buy are logged according to strict laws. This really isn't our issue. Talk to your government. The Canadian government has to regulate and control and oversee. In the case of Scott Paper, Greenpeace's response was simple. The government has been intransigent on this issue. These issues are your problem now. As long as you buy these products, you have a choice. And that's when we showed Scott Paper the ads we had mocked up showing a cute little puppy that looked exactly like the one in their ads falling downstairs with the soft toilet paper rolls. In this ad, however, there was a cartoon speech bubble coming from the puppy's mouth that said, "I destroy rainforests to make toilet paper." Then the UK campaigner I was with said, "We'll have fleets of people going through supermarkets, putting these on all the toilet paper on all the shelves of every store, because we believe your customers have a right to know where your paper comes from. You choose. You have 30 days. As the VP tried to catch his breath, we left the meeting. Scott Paper was the first company to cancel its contract for rainforest pulp from Macmillan Bloedel. The contract was worth several $millions. That was the beginning of the markets campaign to stop the logging in Clayoquot Sound. Whew, that's a lot of history. Okay, so the book goes on to talk about the markets campaign and then also my own, what I call climate reckoning, my dawning awareness of climate change and my shifting my work from forests to fossil fuels. I'm going to read you a short piece on that and then a piece I wrote at the end of the book. This is from chapter 13, The Atmosphere Doesn't Negotiate. There's a quote at the top. It says, "Abrupt and potentially catastrophic climate changes are not only possible, but likely in the future. The world's teetering on the brink of abrupt climate change, a change that will be so rapid and unexpected that human and natural systems will have difficulty adapting to it." It's a quote I found when I was reading a US National Research Council study, now 15 years ago. The night before I left for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations in Bali in 2007, I heard my boys talking in their bunk beds. "I hate it when mommy goes away," Quinn said, then 5. Quinn turns 18 next month. "I know, but mommy's going to save the climate," said Forrest, who was 9. Forrest's confidence in me was crushing and motivating at the same time. I was due for a sabbatical. When we created forest ethics during the markets campaigns, we'd built in the principle that after you were there for 7 years, you could take a 3-month paid break. I was planning to enjoy my time off and recharge, and I knew I needed it because I was dissatisfied with my work. We were having huge successes like the Victoria's Secret campaign, but I was finding myself short-tempered, frustrated, and annoyed. It felt as if no one was doing enough. None of our ideas were good enough. The progress was not fast enough. I'd started seeing reports about the impacts of climate change, the increased fires in the boreal, the pine beetle devastations in British Columbia, and the desertification in the Amazon. There was this little voice in the back of my head saying, you got into this because you wanted to protect forests, and now it's pretty clear that industrial logging may not be the greatest impact on forests today. But there was a much bigger voice saying, thank God someone else is working on that. I was happy to listen to this voice because I didn't know how to deal with climate change. I worked on logging issues, but the voice persisted. And that year I started researching climate matters from a forest issue perspective. How does industrial logging impact global warming? How is global warming impacting the health of our forests? The research led to an invitation from a number of environmental groups to speak in Bali on the impacts of logging on global warming, the impacts of global warming on the boreal, and the importance of the boreal forest as a carbon storehouse. In a mad scramble right before Bali, I thought, God, how could I have an impact here though? What is the conversation that really needs to happen in Bali? My focus was the forest, but I was worried about Canada's tar sands. I just read an amazing book called Stupid to the Last Drop, How Alberta is Bringing Environmental Armageddon to Canada and Doesn't Seem to Care, by William Marsden, and I loved it. So I called his publisher, Louise Dennis, executive vice president of Random House of Canada. I'd never met her before. I cold called her. I told her how much I loved the book, how important it was, and that I was going to the United Nations Climate Change Conference. I'm wondering if she could spare a few copies. She was happy to oblige. I went to Bali, dragging 2 hockey bags full of copies of Stupid to the Last Drop to give out to everyone I saw. Intense conversations started for me the second I landed, as conference delegates found one another in the baggage claim and the visa lines. Before I'd even collected my baggage, I'd given out several copies of Stupid to the Last Drop that I had in my briefcase. I eventually handed a copy directly to the Minister of Energy for Alberta, and I distributed them at all the briefings and Canadian government press conferences. It made them crazy, in large part because Canada, like so many other countries in Bali, was trying to portray itself as a climate leader while hiding its growing oil developments. In the shuttle to the hotel, I was at a loss to explain to academics from France and Germany why so few people realized that Canada was creating the largest and most destructive fossil fuel projects in the world and had become the biggest exporter of oil to the United States. As a Canadian, I came to Bali with the knowledge that under Stephen Harper's conservative government, we had scuttled the potential of a significant agreement at the Commonwealth talks that year in New York, which could have committed many countries to strong mandatory reductions in fossil fuel emissions. I was also painfully aware that we were one of the few countries that had reneged on our commitments under the Kyoto protocols, and we were balking at making any new commitments. So that was a bit of kind of my dawning of climate awareness. I'm going to skip forward though, if I can find it quickly for you. So a couple of years later, because, you know, I kind of think of my work as though there are these moments, you know, reckoning moments where everything shifts for me. It was like recognizing we needed to follow the money and the strategies to stop the logging of old growth. And there was a moment for me on tar sands issues and climate change that was a really big deal. I'm going to see if I could find it. Okay. There's a very funny moment in the book when I met with the Harper's Minister of Environment, Chief of Staff, but I'll leave you to read that. Okay, just later in that same chapter, page 234, on the way to Copenhagen negotiations a couple of years later. Flying into Copenhagen from London, I discovered I was sitting next to the chief climate negotiator for Liberia. I asked him how it was going. He looked at me as if I was an idiot. Well, today people are dying and more people will die tomorrow. So far, nothing we've done will help them. Like, what do you say to that? Would you like my pretzels? I was on the flight to the world's largest climate conference because I was worried about the future for my children, my family, and my country. He was on the flight because people in his country were already dying every day. They were running out of water. They're running out of food. They don't have the infrastructure to deal with the increase in violent storms. He seemed so completely disheartened, past the point of being angry, less like a negotiator than a mourner. I started to think past my own national interest and contemplate the importance that a global deal in Copenhagen would have for other countries around the world. My seatmate and I spoke again as we collected our luggage, and I told him about our debates back in Canada over tar sands, also the debates and the opposition to wind farms in Ontario, run-of-river hydro in BC. He was amazed at Canada's regressive position in the negotiations and the opposition to renewable energy products. With a weary look, he said, "It's nice. It's nice you still have time to talk about whether to build windmills or not. We're more focused on figuring out how many people are going to die this year because of drought." One of those moments that really shifts things into perspective. Okay, I'm going to go to the conclusion of this book, and then I'm going to switch gears and read you something I wrote recently as my final piece. So this comes from the conclusion of This Crazy Time. Half the people I talk to after my climate speeches say, "I feel like I'm going crazy. I had to stop reading about it." I've met people who've stopped working on environmental issues because of climate change. I asked one friend why he'd walked away from a local climate campaign he'd been working on, and he said, "Because my soul hurts too much." There are going to be climate reckoning self-help groups in a couple of years. Oh, that's funny, I'd forgotten I wrote that. There already are. I've already heard of a counselor in Canada who works with couples in crisis because one of them is more worried about climate than the other. When I had my climate reckoning, I delved into the writings of experts like George Monbiot, and I was the friend you didn't want at your dinner party. I remember a New Year's Eve in 2008 when someone asked me about the work I was doing. I started discussing the dramatic impacts of climate change that we're already seeing in vulnerable countries, my fear about the unstable path we're on. Before I knew it, the party had gone silent, and the two people beside me had tears running down their faces, and I thought, "Oh crap, I'm the bummer girl. I'm the channel you change because you're too tired, so you flip to a rerun of Friends." It's true. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Our world has changed permanently, and for many of us, the way that we look at the world has changed forever. However, when I think of giving up, I remind myself that we've done this before. The Montreal Protocol worked. Today, the holes in the ozone layer are smaller, and in some places, they're even healed. I remind myself how much has changed for the positive in just the past couple of years, and that we have the technology for economically viable solutions at hand. New scientists ran the numbers on what it's going to cost consumers to have a clean energy transition and projected that radical cuts to the UK's emissions would cause barely noticeable increases in the price of food, drink, and most other goods by 2050. Electricity and gasoline costs would rise significantly, but with the right policies in place, the modelers believe this increase need not lead to big lifestyle changes. These results show that the global project to fight climate change is doable, said Alex Bowen, a climate policy expert at the London School of Economics. It's not such a big ask as people are making out. Though the results spoke directly to UK consumers, previous research came to similar consumer conclusions for Americans. One study found that if Americans were to cut their emissions by 50% by 2050, prices of most consumer goods would increase by less than 5% as a result. These findings were consistent with analysis by the Pew Center on Global Climate Change in Washington, D.C. Even cutting emissions by 80% over 4 decades has a small effect on consumers in most areas, said Manik Roy of the Pew Center. How do we convince our governments that they have the social license, that we will support them if they make these changes? We need to start with that vision. A well-known pollster told me that travel agents don't talk about the cost or the flight to Hawaii, they talk about the beach. And one of the most inspiring speakers I know, Van Jones, is fond of saying, "There's a reason Martin Luther King never said, 'I have a kvetch' or 'I have a problem,' because the problem rarely inspires action and commitment. It's the dream. That's why we need to talk about the dream." Shock and horror rarely seed engagement, they seed helplessness in our souls. We need to talk about global warming and deforestation We need to stop talking about global warming and deforestation without talking about responsibility and identifying what we can do to create the world that we want. Oh, that whole section is a little bit dated. I'm going to just skip forward now. When I started this work, I thought I had all the answers. Now I know that no one does. The best we can do is really listen to others and to ourselves. Then we need to make choices and act, guided by what we've learned, our capacity and resources, and our principles. There is no roadmap for social change and no single way to engage in these issues. In the end, it's about creativity, commitment, courage, and a little bit of magic. Global warming is real. Its agents invisible, its schedule unaligned with daily human timeframes. In a sense, we're all still sleepwalking through denial, unable to grapple with the enormity of the problem and the scale of the changes needed. I'm sympathetic to the difficulties of building a new generation of environmentalism, of coming to terms with the compromises we need to make and the speed with which they need to happen. But the laws of physics have no such sympathy. Either we make the change or we're on the sidelines while half the world's species and far too many of our fellow humans are sentenced to oblivion. After attending the UN negotiations in Bali, I spent a week with my 92-year-old grandmother, not long before she died. One day we were sitting in the hospital and I told her about my despair. She said, I don't want to hear anymore about how hard it is, how big it is, and that you don't know if it will work. When your mother was growing up, when I was having my 7 children, we didn't have a phone. We had a party line. We didn't have a car. No one had their own car. We had just gotten electricity. We didn't even have computers. We didn't have cell phones. No one had even thought of them yet, let alone that raspberry you're always holding, she said, looking at my ever-present BlackBerry. I never would have thought that in my lifetime, I'd be sitting here talking to my granddaughter about what the world was like, and it would be an entirely different world. The way we communicate is different. The way we move about the world is different. By the time I was an adult and having children, I'd never met anyone who had been on a plane. You need to hold on to the fact that when the world can entirely change in your lifetime. So when I do this work every day, I'm holding on to the notion that one day I'm going to be sitting with my grandchildren, telling them about this crazy time not too long ago, when we were destroying some of the world's old growth forests to make catalogs and toilet paper. This crazy time in our history when we clawed at the earth to get at the last of the oil. A simply crazy time in our history when we used to fill our cars with gas, and they will barely believe me because the world will be such a different place. All right, well, that's this crazy time. Some excerpts from it all the way through. And I'm going to finish today's reading by reading from a more recent piece that I contributed to an incredible book that was edited by Catriona Sandilands. It's called Rising Tides, Reflections for Climate Changing Times. And I can't emphasize too much how much I love these essays. And there are pieces that I've never read anywhere else, reflections by so many incredible authors on what worries us, what we imagine, what we've lost, and in my case, on parenting. Okay, last piece for today. I wrote this, I think it's now only a year ago, is that? Yeah, it's much more recent. The piece is called Just Don't Say It. After a long winter of rain in Vancouver, feeling battered by the storms and the strange amount of snow and ice that our city was simply not set up to deal with, we arrived on Cortes Island off the coast of British Columbia for a glorious month of walking the white sand beaches and exploring one of the richest tidal lagoons on the West Coast. Manson's Lagoon has been a special place for our family since our boys were little. When we moved back to British Columbia to find a place where Forrest and Quinn could grow up connected to nature. I'll never forget explaining tides to Forrest, then 4 years old, when we moved. That day, his preschool went to the lagoon to search for treasures. As the tide started trickling in, I pointed it out to him, showing him the markings on the rocks 10 feet up, explaining how the lagoon would fill and empty twice a day. Dropping his bucket in alarm, he took off for the beach faster than I've ever seen him run, yelling to his new friends, "The tide is coming! Run for your lives!" I doubled over, trying not to laugh as I realized I hadn't explained how long it took for the tide to come in. We look forward every summer to returning to Cortez. As the sun shines, we walk through the lagoon at low tide, amazed at the complexity of the ocean floor, gingerly stepping over clam beds, huge populations of sand dollars, and thousands of sharp oyster shells. This year, as we near one of our favorite spots, a small island that's usually crowded with life, it slowly dawns on us that we haven't seen a single starfish clinging to the rocks. Last year, there were dozens piled on top of each other in a glorious orange and purple display. Maybe it's just currents and they've moved, Quinn says hopefully. We continue to explore and we eventually find 2 starfish, dying, cloudy and soft. My stomach drops. I'd read earlier in the year of increasing ocean acidification impacting the scallop industry, and I'd seen projections of the impact of warming oceans on sea life for decades. Staring down at the dying starfish, Forrest mumbles fiercely under his breath, "Don't say it. Just don't say it. Everything is not about climate change. Can you please just let us have this moment, this place?" With an aching heart, I realize yet again how hard it is for my boys to grow up at this moment in history, bombarded with the daily evidence of climate change. I want more than anything for my boys to be carefree, to feel like their future holds unlimited promise. Yet every day they are faced with news of unprecedented floods, fires, and droughts. I can't stop thinking about how hard it is for this generation to manage the daily changes, the litany of disasters, the constant warnings. More than anything, I feel their cognitive dissonance. They live in a visibly warming world, but for the most part, the adults around them continue on as though nothing has changed. The following summer, we spend weeks inside because the blanket of smoke that has settled outside our house and around our house is so thick we can't see the lake across the road or go outside without coughing. We read in horror about the hundreds of fires in BC and Alberta as we close our window and cancel our plans for hiking and kayaking. With anxious faces, the boys ask us if everything will ever go back to normal, or if the smoke and fires are something we now have to plan around every year. They show me YouTube videos that summer of people in Toronto having to swim off the King Street streetcar during flash flooding. We read articles together about people dying in Quebec due to the heat waves. We watch, incredulous, as California burns. "It is happening now, isn't it?" asks Forrest. Quinn retreats into computer games, worlds that he can control. They don't know who to support with their first federal election votes. My activism is now infused with the anger of a mother bear. In this climate changing era, no one has all the answers. We need healthy debate and dialogue about how to build a new clean energy economy. Engineers, economists, and scientists tell us that we have the technology to make the changes we need, and that inaction will cost us more. Yet here we sit in Canada, debating how to help the oil industry expand, while our children watch the demise of the natural world on which we all depend. Forrest and Quinn are watching their freedom go up in smoke. When I went to university, I had choices. I could be an artist, a musician, a scientist, a writer. Current climate projections tell us that we are on a trajectory to a world that could warm between 4 and 6 degrees, a level of warming that is already resulting in a massive increase in severity and frequency of violent storms that will lead to millions of people displaced. This year, the United Nations reported that more people lost their homes due to climate change than war. Around the world, many universities and schools were closed this year because of floods, droughts, heat waves. Will our children have the luxury of studying a Mozart concerto, reading Plato, or losing themselves in the complexities of mycorrhizal fungi when they're struggling for water? I want my children to be safe, but perhaps even more, I want them to have the choices I had about who I could become and what I wanted to do. The mist is rising on Burnaby Mountain as the Indigenous elders singing and drumming lead us towards the gates of the tank farm. As we arrive, I see many people I know. Engineers, scientists, economists, politicians take their place on the blockade. I go to speak to an elderly woman who's shaking with cold as she limps to take her place. Are you sure you want to be doing this? I ask her. She looks up at Forrest at my side, now 6 feet tall. I'm a retired teacher. I'm sick of sitting home and watching this happen. Right now, at this moment in history, there is no place I would rather be. Forrest and I feel the same way. Taking action with those who feel the same way seems to alleviate some of our anxiety and despair. We're at the blockades at the tank farm of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, a pipeline proposed to go through our community and dramatically expand oil tankers right through the Burrard Inlet, facilitating an expansion of the oil sands at the exact moment in history when scientists are telling us that we need to phase down the expansion of oil and gas, in fact, all fossil fuels, as quickly as possible in order to keep us safe. As I watched Forrest this year volunteering for the 350.org chapter at his university, organizing rallies on divestment, I'm proud. But I'm also sad that he feels he has to spend his free time this way when I know he'd rather be skiing and climbing and kayaking. I struggle with being honest with him when we talk about whether political change will happen quickly enough to reverse the warming trends we see all around us. Quinn tells me that he's proud of my work on climate change, but he's retreated from the issues. He's stopped going to speeches and rallies, and more often than not, he can be found debating game strategy with virtual teams of people in far-flung countries that he's met online. This activity is a relief for me in some ways, but I also have to struggle to understand and accept it. We discuss over dinner whether virtual realities and communities are real, and about how, for many people, the online world seems to be a relief from our ever-changing and threatening physical world. In my activism, I have to face the science and politics of climate change every day. I run environmental campaigns to try and get decision makers to change laws and policies to address the challenges we face. Progress is often slow. The changes in our energy system are now faster than they've ever been, and I think one of the keys to relieving anxiety in my boys is tracking and holding on to those signs of hope. On our good days, we have conversations about how exciting it is to be living in this moment of great change. They talk about all the things they're seeing around them, the cool electric cars and trucks, the high-speed rail, the big renewable energy projects. I tell them stories about how when I was in university, there were no cell phones or even internet, how quickly the world can change. As I write this, hundreds of thousands of young people are marching around the world in student strikes for action on climate change. While I know we live in a warming world and will continue to see devastating changes in the places we love, I hope that we're truly living at a tipping point moment on climate change, driven by the engagement of youth. That was from Rising Tides. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. Thank you for joining me.